Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. My guest today is Alex Duff, the author of Smart Money, The Fall and Rise of Brentford FC. The book offers a rich history of the fascinating football club founded way back in 1889. Brentford more recently used data and mathematics to improve dramatically, and it secured a position in the fiercely competitive English Premier League. And this book is all about that story and a lot more. Hi, Alex. Thanks very much for joining in.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, Alex, the first question is a club that was founded way back in the day when it had a shot at the Premier League with the top guns. Where were you when Brentford played Arsenal in 2021 and ended up beating them?
I was at home, so I lived just outside Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. I watched. Here we get all the Premier League games, so I can watch every single Brentford game. I was at home watching. I obviously much rather have been at the stadium, but I didn't. I didn't have a ticket for that game. But it was still a wonderful experience to see Brentford play in the Premier League, and something that I'd really never expected to happen in my lifetime because I've been supporting the team for like 40 or so years, and for the vast majority of those years we've been in the third division or the fourth division, and never really looked like we would ever go up the leagues. So it was, and it still is, sometimes a bit difficult to comprehend that we are still in the Premier League.
Yeah, and what is it about football and the bond that fans have with their respective teams? And I live in a country where cricket is big. It's a religion in India, is how they call it. And we've got the English Premier League equivalent called Indian Premier League. And we've got these different teams, but there is nothing that comes close to the kind of fanaticism, if there is a word like that, and the bond that fans have for their football clubs. It is passed on from generations, I believe. How was it for you? Was your father, grandfather, or did they support them? Why is that different? And that itself is a little fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have the answer to that. It's quite difficult to put your finger on why we become so sort of devoted to a single club. It's irrational in some ways. So I can't give you the proper answer. I can give you my own experience. And so my father, he was brought up in the northeast of England, in Sunderland, which has its own team with quite a lot of history. And so he'd moved down to London, and I was born in London, and our local team was Brentford. And so we didn't have any family link to the club, but it was the local team, and I was obsessed with football aged 7. He decided to take me to the Brentford game when I was 7, and then it became a sort of ritual that we'd go to home games, and that, for whatever reason, we just became Brentford fans. I think there's an old cliche saying you never change your football team. You can change your wife, but it's more difficult to change a football team. As I said, I don't really have a good reason why people become so devoted. It just seems to be part of the sort of psyche of football fans that they're very devoted. Maybe in England, it has to do with some cases to do with family and history, and so and maybe with modern fans you know, the new generation of fans, they are not as devoted maybe as my generation, because maybe they
Mm.
grow up watching more on television, and so there's not that link from community, you know, being your local club, so, and knowing the area and knowing the people. Maybe that, you know, as you get a more global audience, maybe fans will become less devoted, but it
Mm.
could be that they're as devoted as everyone. So it could be there's some kind of psychological reason, but I don't have that
Yeah.
reason.
Right. No, but is it any different for a Brentford supporter like you as compared to, say, a Manchester City supporter where, you know, they expect to win every game? So when you win, is that joy that much more magnified as compared to the pain of losing? How does that work as a fan yourself?
I think, you know, as a Brentford fan, you become used to, you become a certain, you accept defeat more easily. Maybe it's not, um, it's not something you enjoy, but I
Hmm.
think it definitely, you know, if you've been brought up with a team which doesn't win much, then you don't have such high expectations.
Yeah.
In a way, it's easier because you don't need to win to be satisfied, as long as you, you know, I think we spent maybe 15, 20 years without moving from the third tier,
Hmm.
when I was growing up. And it almost became normal. You know, you didn't expect any more, so your expectations change.
Yeah.
I think if you were a Manchester City fan, and let's remember, Manchester City weren't 20 years ago, they weren't a
Right.
very strong team. So you will have fans
Hmm.
who are used to losing. But I think now they have expectations to win a lot, and
Right.
so your expectations change depending on the size of the team.
Right. I remember, I think it was Stephen Fry who was asked in one of the interviews. He supports Norwich, a small club compared to, say, Manchester United. And he said that the joy of winning when it's a smallish club is far more intense than the pain of losing, because although you expect your team to do well and win, they don't always win. So you have that much more joy. And I was surprised to read. So I had no idea about Brentford other than watching them in the Premier League. But the history, and I'll let you paint it a little bit for me. But the statistics, like in 1962, Brentford was relegated to the fourth division, is what I read in your book, after having reached the first one. So it was a precipitous drop. And again, in 1980, you're losing some 3,000 pounds a week, and again were in danger to be relegated to the fourth division. So it has been quite a topsy turvy ride for the club then.
Yeah, I think like many clubs, smaller clubs, the there wasn't much of a strategy. I think it was just you know, the chairman and the board. The only real objective they had was to keep the club
Mm.
solvent, and there was never really enough money or enough ambition to be any more ambitious than that. And I think that's the case for a lot of clubs in England. They just do not have the resources to be able to compete, and so just remaining solvent is in itself not that, it's somewhat of a challenge,
Mm.
because there's not much television, if any, television revenue that goes to the lower league clubs, and there's no real incentive to invest in a football club unless you happen to be a fan.
Mm.
It's not a business which makes much money. You know, almost
Right.
all the income is ploughed back into the team, um, and therefore, you know, it's sort of, unless you have someone with a lot of money or a lot of ambition, you're pretty much stuck in this cycle of just surviving,
Mm.
and just staying alive.
And how was it for Brentford in terms of the backing that they had from their sponsors or the owners? Were they rich at the beginning, or were always somewhere in the middle? I read somewhere that fans were sponsoring socks for players, £10 per person. There was a time when even that happened. So how was that for Brentford?
Yeah, so for most of the 20th century, Brentford would have sort of a board of directors and a chairman who are local businessmen,
Hmm.
who kind of put forward a certain amount of capital, say I think around £20,000 perhaps, and they so not a huge amount of money, but a decent amount of money, especially 40 years ago. That was quite a lot of money, and so they would run the club. That would earn them the right to run the club and sort of be associated with the club, and they could go to the boardroom, but there was never really any intention that they were going to get a return on that investment. It
Hmm.
was just a sort of nice thing to do if you'd become a successful businessman, to take a position on the board and help run the local football team. So there was never really any idea that those local businessmen would actually, do much with the club. They certainly didn't plan to buy it as an investment. So, but that all changed like in the 1960s. A local politician or someone who was running to become a Labour member of Parliament, he bought a majority stake in the club. Um, and his idea was to take Brentford up the league, and he was quite ambitious. He was quite unusual. He was quite young. I think he was in his late 30s, and he intended to partly use the club as a way to market his career as a politician. But the problem was he was selected not to run in London where Brentford was, but to run in Nottingham, and so he soon got. It didn't really work, this marketing part of the strategy, and he got tired of trying to make it a successful club, and he decided to sell the club, or try and sell the club, to Queen's Park Rangers, which is a sort of local rival. That would have made him some decent money, but it would have meant the club folded and ceased to exist. So that was really the first time where there was a majority owner who sort of tried to make some money from the club, and the fans obviously turned against him, and he soon had to give up that idea because there was so much opposition
Hmm.
to it. But and then the sort of board reverted back to the previous model, which was right, just a group of businessmen who tried to keep the status quo. And so for much of the 20th century, there was just these local businessmen who'd mainly retired, or were in their 60s
Hmm.
maybe, and they were more like guardians than owners. They were like
Right.
it was almost like it was a community asset, and
Hmm.
they were there just to make sure the club um, maintained its existence, and yeah, it was a slightly unusual role, but yeah, they recognized the value of the club to the local community, and the idea was that they would do everything they could to just keep it going.
Hmm. And what changed over the years, in the last 30 years, or was it 20, when Matthew Benham, this gentleman, came in and
Mm.
transformed or started the journey towards the transformation? So what changed there, and who is Mr. Benham?
So Matthew Benham yeah, he started going to Brentford around the same time as me in the late 70s or early 80s. And then he yeah, like many people, his sort of passion for the club faded a little bit because he moved to another part of London and had a family and work, and so he wasn't going to every single game, but he was very successful in professional gambling. He'd started out working in the City of London, in the financial district of London, as a derivatives trader. Um, he he was very good with numbers. He'd gone to Oxford University to
Mm.
study physics, and a very clever guy. And he was making a lot of money in the city as a trader. And then he sort of switched to professional gambling, which has many of the same skill sets as derivatives trading. You've got to be good with numbers. You've got to take a lot of risks, have a model, and stick to your model when you're betting. He developed a model to rate the underlying strength of football teams, which was based on not on their goals or their points tally, but on their goal scoring opportunities. So he felt that this was a better way to rank the teams, and so he used it to bet. Most of the betting was in Asia, in the Far East, because that is where the most liquidity is in the football gambling market. And so he made a lot of money from that. And it's in the early 2000s, around 20 or so years ago, he heard that Brentford was in financial difficulties because the owner wanted to get rid of the club and didn't want to sort of keep on sort of being liable for their overdraft, which had reached about £5 million. And so the supporters decided that they wanted to take over the club from the owner, and but they had no money to do so. So Matthew Benham contacted the supporters group, which is called Bees United, and asked how he could help, because he had a lot of money, a lot of funds from professional gambling. And so he initially loaned £500,000 to the club to help the supporters take over the club. And then for the next couple of years, the supporters were still pretty broke, and they kept asking for a bit more money here to pay the bills. And he kept on loaning more and more money. And eventually he said, okay, I want some equity for my money, because I'm giving you all these, I think he lent £4 or £5 million already. And he gradually turned that into equity and built up his stake. Initially, he was not really involved with the running of the club. He wasn't on the board, or he didn't have an executive role. But eventually, he decided, okay, I would like to have a go at trying to run the club a bit better, because I think it feels like it's not being run as efficiently as it could be. It was a very sort of, the supporters were very well-meaning. They worked very hard, but they just didn't have the resources to turn around the club. And so he got involved with the running of the club. He didn't just put forward money, but he put forward his expertise, which was sort of quantitative analysis. And he started to apply what he'd learned from being a trader and then as a gambler, using quantitative analysis, try to apply that to football.
Right.
And at first it was quite difficult, because football people are not used to that kind of approach. The managers in football tend to be former football players who normally implement techniques and strategies based on what they've been taught as a player. And so there isn't much, well, certainly at the time he got involved, there weren't many people from outside football who came in and tried to, you know, change things.
Right.
So he came in and initially had some pushback from the people in football in the club saying we don't do it like that. This is, but
Right.
he said, well, it's my money. I'm investing. I think I should have a say in
Right.
how the club is run. And so gradually he brought in quantitative analysis
Yeah.
in the recruitment of players.
Mm.
So um, he would he would get the people from his gambling syndicate uh, who who are like quantitative analysts and specialists in analytics to draw up a model to rate players based on quite complex data, and then he would sign these players, and it would turn out to be very effective. And Brentford
Right.
signed players who they were able to sell on for big fees to bigger clubs, and so it
Mm.
started to at least mitigate some of his outlay, some of his spending, and pay for
Right.
some of his spending. So that was really the first step
Mm.
towards shifting the model at Brentford. Um, uh, the other thing he did was apply some of the quantitative analysis to the actual tactics
Mm.
and the way Brentford took corner kicks or free kicks, the way they played, the tactics they took was based
Right.
on quantitative analysis of games. So the professional gambling syndicate, they analyze deeply every single game, or most top level professional games. So they have this huge database of information which they can actually use
Mm.
to make decisions for Brentford. So they were not only working for the professional gambling syndicate, they were also working for Brentford. So you had these really intelligent, bright
Yeah.
um, people actually being employed by Brentford to gain an edge, first in the
Right.
transfer market and then with tactical decisions. And, for a team in the second or third division, that's a huge advantage because nobody else at that level was really
Mm.
doing that. So that gave Brentford a really big edge in terms of some of their bigger rivals
Right.
in those leagues.
And did it also coincide all of this, or his entry or takeover, so to speak, of Brentford with generally the way football was being played in England? It's quite famous that former players, now that they are pundits and commentators, they talk about how Roy Keane, recently the former captain of Manchester United, the Irish player, he said that they would go out drinking through the night, and just about be ready for the 2 nights before the game they would try and stay away, but it was far less professional in that sense. In the days leading up to the match, obviously they were professional players and they'd give it their best when they were on the field, but these things probably are frowned upon today then. And because if so did this mathematical rigor also coincide with the general switch in culture of English football, and did that also have something to do with Brentford's success as well?
Yes, definitely it did. The mathematical side was one part of it, but he hired a new coach called Mark Warburton, who
Mhm.
like him had not really much background in football. He'd been a non-league player growing up, but then he became a currency trader. So he also worked in the City of London, and he had decided to switch careers and to try and go into football.
Mm.
And he'd done a tour of all the big clubs in Europe to work out what methods they were using in terms of sports science. what coaching methods they were using. Basically, he went around just gathering up insight from some of the biggest clubs in Europe.
Mm.
And he then began working for Brentford, first as a sort of sports director. So not as the actual manager, but the sports director overseeing the setup. And he introduced many of these new ideas, or many of these ideas that he'd picked up
Right.
at clubs across Europe. For example, Sporting Lisbon, where Cristiano Ronaldo was brought up, and also at Ajax in the Netherlands, and a few other clubs in Spain and elsewhere. And so
Mm.
they sort of upgraded their sports science. There was really sports science did not really exist in at Brentford until
Right.
he arrived in around 15 years ago. And certainly, as you say, in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, and as Roy Keane said, players would go out drinking in the middle of the week, and the diet was not very good,
Right.
not not a very nutritious diet. And so, yeah, the English football was maybe about 15, 20 years behind American sports in terms of nutrition. Um, and Brentford was no exception.
Mm.
And so that also, yeah, that sports science also
Right.
was introduced at the same time as the mathematical approach.
Right. I think it was Ian Wright, the Arsenal legend. He was complaining about his boss, Arsene Wenger, that he would make them eat chicken or no, sorry, it was something. So it was very austere diet where they could not have spices or too much salt, and they knew exactly every morsel of food that would go in their body was measured, so much so that the coach himself, the manager, Wenger, he would also accompany them just to set an example. So, and that's when they won the Premier League. They were called the Invincibles, etc. So, also this data you talked about how Brentford started using it. You also write in your book that use of data to predict results is not entirely new. In that, gambling, for example, has been using data for a number of years now. So, a few things that you write about is injuries, rehabilitation of a player, or even whether he's going through a relationship crisis or he's just had a breakup, and will that data point impact his performance on the field? So it's been around for a while then.
Yeah, I mean, the data, I think Arsene Wenger was one of the first people to use data in terms of recruitment. But there's also an interesting era when Bolton Wanderers, which was the club which was one of the big clubs in the early years of the Football League, because during the Industrial Revolution, Bolton was a big town with a lot of factories and a big supporter base. But then, like Brentford, became less important as a town, and the football club deteriorated in tandem with that decline of the town. And so they began using data around the early 2000s, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And they began to look a bit deeper at data, and they hired players in their later who are maybe in their mid-30s, who the idea, or most people felt, that if you got to your mid-30s, you were probably too old to play in the Premier League. But they actually looked at the data and saw that actually those kind of players were running as much as the players in their 20s. So they used basic data to make some decisions. And they actually outperformed much bigger teams. In I think 2005, Bolton finished sixth in the Premier League, which was quite outstanding, given that they had one of the smallest budgets in the league.
Mm.
So they were one of the first clubs to sort of really look at different ways of doing things. You know, big clubs like Manchester United, they consistently won the Premier League, and what came before the Division One, which was preceded the Premier League. This was based on the quality of their players and some good coaching.
Mm.
And so if you were winning the Premier League every other year, you didn't really feel the need to sort of do anything differently.
Mm.
You know, Alex Ferguson was a very skillful manager,
Right.
and he was asked, "Would you be interested in using more data?" And he said, "Yeah, it's interesting, but it's not really going to be a game changer."
Mm.
That I think that kind of outlook has now changed, and
Right.
most of the big clubs in the Premier League will now realise that data is a very important part of football. It's not perhaps the
Mm.
most important thing, but it's you need to be taking data very seriously in making decisions. So there's been a gradual shift over the last 20 years, which I think is now become established in the
Mm.
Premier League. If you want to be competitive and you want to keep competing at the top
Right.
level, you need to be spending quite a lot of resources on data and data analytics, and that's been a gradual
Yeah.
process, which I think started in probably in US sports and has gradually
Mm.
migrated to football.
And when you say data, I was surprised as to the, you know, the level to which the data is scraped or collected. One of them was pass completion. When you pass the ball to another player and the player accepts it and then passes on to the next one, the pass completion was also correlated with the spectator noise, which is to say that whether the player could pass when the atmosphere would get noisy and that he was good under pressure is what the inference might be. So these are, I mean, can you give a couple of examples of the kind of ludicrous lens that they go to scrape data, which a normal fan or an observer will not comprehend?
Yeah. Well, so in the first sort of phase of data analytics, which is with Bolton,
Mm.
they were using pretty basic data sets. So pass completion rate, how many passes a player makes successfully during a game. So if you've got 80% or 85% pass completion rate, it means you're pretty
Mm.
a strong player. However, at Brentford, they felt that actually pass completion rate wasn't necessarily a good enough guide on the strength of a player, because you can make a lateral pass which is really easy and doesn't really create any value
Mm.
to the team. You could make 100 lateral passes which don't really get the team anyway. So they tried to find ways of making that the passing metric more more useful or more valuable to them. And so one of the ways they did was, okay, let's track the passes which are in the final third of the opponent's
Mm.
half. You know, those are the most difficult passes to make successfully when there's more defenders around you. And as you say, one of the ways of improving the value of those of that metric is to say, okay, when there's more crowd noise, the situation is tenser, perhaps at the last couple of minutes of the game, or
Mm.
it's a tense point of the match. If you can also measure the crowd noise, then you can perhaps rate the players' calmness under pressure. Like, is he making a good pass in a tense situation when there's a lot of defenders around him. If you can make one of those passes, which is successful,
Yeah.
Then he truly is a great player. He's not just passing it laterally,
Yeah.
and he's passing it in the opponent's penalty box with a lot of crowd noise and like 4 players trying to get the ball off him. That
Yeah.
is if he's making those kind of passes, then you need to factor that into your rating of the player. And so they are building, or they're still building these models which tries to value a player not from the basic metrics,
Yeah.
but from super advanced metrics, which are
Right.
factoring all kinds of different elements. And so this is one way you can rate much better how good a player is.
Right. And
Another
sorry, go
example
ahead.
is a forward, a striker. For instance, the basic parameter of a striker is how many goals you score on average per game. If you're scoring 0.5 goals per game, that means you're a good striker normally. However, if you play for Manchester City and you're playing against the worst team in the Premier League, Sheffield United, and you score a goal, that goal is not worth the same as if you're a Sheffield United player and you score against Manchester City. That's much more difficult because you're playing against the best team in the league and you're the worst team. So what Brentford would do they would rate a striker that they're interested in buying on the strength of his team and the strength of the team he was playing against. And they would sort of weight their metric based on factors such as the relative strength of both teams,
Right.
how many chances he created or he converted in the penalty box, and various other metrics which were much more complex than basic average goals per game. So, these were examples of how they would just go that much deeper with their data than most other clubs.
Or in fact, even this, they must have learned through trial and error, because there was a time when players would fool the data wonks by passing in their own block, in their own half, because they would want the statistics for those passes to increase so that they don't get a rap from the coach at the end of the day. And I think there were defenders who would run up and down the field when nothing was happening really, so that they would know that they've been covering so many miles. So over time, this has also been honed by these analysts, so to speak, then.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I know an example of somebody I know who used to play for a lower league club in England, and he said that there was always like competition to take the kickoff, because that was automatically a successful pass. You couldn't really go wrong with the kickoff. That would always give you one successful pass. So yeah, there are all types of different ways you could try to improve your metrics.
And despite all of this, you also needed to throw some money at the players to keep them interested, right? You write about this, that in the set pieces, that is penalty kicks and free kicks or corner kicks, once, if you could practice enough plays enough number of times, the odds of you scoring a goal would be that much higher. But it would be a boring thing for the players to do the same thing over and over again. So they would throw in a cash bonus as part of the contract, that if you score through a set piece, we'll give you a little more money. And how to do that set piece was driven by data.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the chances of scoring from a corner kick are pretty low. I think it's around 3%.
Oh, is it that low? I had no idea.
Yeah, I think it's pretty low.
Okay.
And so, but if you work out the most likely point to score from a corner kick, you can increase that percentage. And most goals come from, or many, I don't know if most goals, but many goals come from like a scramble in the box when the ball is like ricocheting people's shins and just bouncing around. And that's when you have a high chance of scoring because the ball is out of control.
Hmm.
Very often, what happens is the ball floats in and the defender heads it away, and that's
Yeah.
the chance of scoring is eliminated. But what Brentford try to do is they try to somehow flick the ball into the 5-yard box in the goal mouth, because there is a good chance that the ball will just fall in the right place for somebody to stab it into the net.
Hmm.
And so they have many techniques of sort of running around just as the ball's about to be taken, just to
Yeah.
cause that confusion and to unsettle the defense, and maybe flick the ball into that 5-yard box where somebody can just poach a goal.
Hmm.
And so, yes, they will analyze, they will have this big data set of where, how, and when, where to score goals
Yeah.
at set pieces. And it can it can be the difference between promotion
Yeah.
and not being promoted, or it can give you a couple of extra can push you up a couple of extra posts in the table if
Hmm.
you're clever with your corner kicks and your free kicks. So I think Matthew Benham at Brentford really understood the value of having a statistics based methods when taking corner kicks and free kicks, and unfortunately, a lot of other clubs have also caught up with this now. So
Hmm.
the edge maybe is not as big as it used to be.
No, but as early as, was it last year or the year before last, when Brentford beat Liverpool? I think it was 3-1, where Brentford scored through two corner kicks. And the exact thing that you mentioned, where they created a bit of an artificial chaos within within the box. And I think Liverpool players were caught off guard, and two of them went in, which is a pretty good outcome to reading data. That if this is, I mean, a set piece which was data driven eventually won a game against a huge club. And I think you write in a very funny way in your book, and you say that as though Liverpool players had lost their wallets to a gang of professional pickpockets, is how you put it. So this is an example of how data can indeed work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think with the pickpockets analogy, you probably, or you might have even had the bad experience of being pickpocketed. It's like the idea is that the pickpocket guy will distract your attention
Right.
and make you look at something else and create some kind of confusion, and then
Hmm.
take your wallet. And so, in a way, it's the same thing in the
Yeah.
corner kick. Brentford players will run across the goal and confuse the goalkeeper, and
Hmm.
then create that
Yeah.
confusion, allowing perhaps somebody to score. So,
Right.
yeah, it's I guess it's you would, I think, maybe 10, 20 years ago, if you look at the corner kicks back then, they were not nearly
Hmm.
as chaotic as they are today.
So while this was an example where data has helped, even though these numbers are presented to the management or whoever is reading them, they can also get it wrong, right? I remember reading another book called Expected Goals by Rory Smith, another good, beautiful book about data and how it's helping football. I read an anecdote about Jaap Stam, the former Manchester United legend, who was then sold off because the data suggested that he was making fewer tackles. But apparently it was an incorrect sale, because he was still good and he won a few trophies for the next team that he went for. The reason he was making fewer tackles is that he didn't have to. A good defender could get to the ball sooner as compared to the relatively not so great ones, where they have to tackle as a last resort. So this was an example. They say that they read the wrong numbers, even though the numbers were right, or they read it incorrectly. So that can also happen then.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's so much data that's available for analysis. The question is what you do with that data, and
Hmm.
you have to make the right decisions. You can and one of the things at Brentford, one of their sort of mottos is we have to stress test our ideas. You have to get different people to analyze ideas to make sure that they're not the wrong ones. And so when the new coach joins Brentford, certainly the last couple of coaches, they've had to sign an agreement which says they will not dismiss ideas. They will discuss ideas with other people to make sure that the wrong decision is not being made. And so there's very much a meritocracy at the club where different people can provide input and try to make sure that those kind of yap stam situations do not happen, because if you've got 10 people analyzing decision making, then you've got more chance of spotting errors. So there's very much a sort of communal approach to decision making, which perhaps is not happening at other clubs as to the same extent. Obviously, different clubs do different things, but I would suggest traditionally it's been the manager of a football club who made the most important decisions. Traditionally throughout most of the history in British football, is the manager who's been making decisions. Maybe has an assistant who gives some input, but the idea at Brentford is very much to get away from that sort of autocratic rule and try to make decisions based on group thinking.
How do they balance that? You've on one hand, you have got a former player, let's say, who knows a thing or two about football, and he's coaching the team. And then you've got people who know nothing about football. And to give you an example, there are stories where these analysts don't watch games at all, but can tell what went right or wrong and give recommendations. So in other words, they don't know anything about football, but they are, brilliant rocket scientists who are, let's say, employed as quants. Now, how do you balance the two? How does a manager keep an open mind to be influenced by data? And one great thing is that it's written in part of the contract, as part of the contract, that they have to keep an open mind. But how did Brentford strike that balance where the traditional approach was not entirely dismissed, and at the same time, the traditional guys were okay to be influenced by numbers that were given by people who understood nothing about football?
Well, what happened at Brentford? I think Matthew Benham makes probably quite a lot of decisions around the game, around the recruitment and around how the club plays. But what he has is one of his quants is now the sporting director. So his sort of eyes and ears is the actual sporting director, a guy with absolutely no football background at all, but is very good at converting concepts and ideas into practice. And so he works with the coach, Thomas Frank, to find some happy medium whereby they can decide an approach to recruitment and an approach to tactics. But I think Matthew Benham is the guy.
So it needs to be driven from. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was saying if there's a dispute, or I think he would be the guy who Matthew Benham would have the final say.
Right.
So yeah, there's only in the reality there's only one boss. But
no, that's interesting. I mean that it needs to be driven from the top, and that it's as black and white as that hey, this is the new way of doing things, and you take a leap of faith. You may fail a few times because even the models keep improving, right? You may despite having stuck to a model and then trying to replicate a play based on some inferences from that data model, you might still fail. But the idea is to probably keep at it and keep improving the model and try and test them out on the field then.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, traditionally football clubs have been very sort of quick to change things when things are not going well. So they lose a few games, and
Yeah.
then there's pressure on the manager, and the manager,
Right.
then the board gets rid of the manager because they want to turn around
Chelsea.
the results.
Right.
But if you have a more stable environment where the owner and the board trust the process, you have a much better way of approaching a game, which depends on luck, but results depend on luck very often, and sometimes you don't want to make decisions based on one or two results. You want to have
Yeah.
a better overview. So the current manager or the current coach of Brentford has been at the club for many years. I think perhaps more than any other Premier League manager, and so there's a very stable environment, and yeah, they clearly have a process in place to decide when to change things and when
Yeah.
not to change things.
And initially, when the data was introduced in football, were there skeptics? Although you had Mr. Benham who wanted this, he'd made his money in gambling, so he knew that this works. But then you talked about Sir Alex Ferguson, who said that yeah, such techniques are of benefit, not a ringing endorsement to this new way of doing things. There was Harry Redknapp, if I'm getting his name right, where he also made light of it, right? I think he made a joke about help me out here. He wasn't very keen on data, so there were skeptics then.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think the old school of managers are very skeptical about data. Yeah, I think Harry Redknapp had a young data guy who was feeding him statistics about a game, and he was slightly annoyed by this. He said, "Look, why don't you get your computer to play their computer and see who wins the game?"
Right.
Clearly, he was not a fan of being told what to do by
Yeah.
data analytics, and this is the problem that Matthew Benham initially had when he came to Brentford, was because people just did not see that as the way to do things, and so even he had trouble um, to sort of get some of this thinking adopted.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think if you're a football manager and you've never really been open to other industries and other ways of thinking, it's normal that you're sort of slightly dubious about some of
Yeah.
some of these ideas that come from outside football.
Yep. And I think Benham also changed the perception of a boss or an owner, right? Who their primary role is just to write checks. I remember, I don't know if you've seen this movie, The Damned United, where it's on the story. I mean, Brian Clough, his story was, played by Martin Sheen, I think, if I'm getting his. And there's a scene where he's confronting the promoter or the owner of the club that your job is to write checks. You bloody well sign them. I'm the one. Leave it to the professionals. I'm the one who's running the club. But that wasn't the case with Benham. He was the guy who would toss ideas to the coach and which could influence tactics on the ground. And what fascinated me was that they were quite open to it, all of them, meaning people could voice an opinion in a room. There was no hierarchy where people didn't feel offended if they were asked to do other things. And of course, Benham led the way. He knew a thing or two about football and data. But did that also help the culture within the club? Also, only kindled, these ideas or helped, experiment more.
Yeah, I think what happened at Brentford was because Benham was having trouble translating his ideas to the club. So what he did was when he bought a club in Denmark called FC Midtjylland, partly because he felt in Denmark they were more open to new approaches and new alternative ways of doing things.
Mm.
So he recognised the sort of Brian Clough stereotype was still present in England,
Mm.
and so he wanted to try out some of the ideas he had about data analytics
Right.
at this club in Denmark, which was a smaller club,
Mm.
far from the capital in Copenhagen. And it was only when he had success with this club,
Mm.
actually won the Danish league for the first time, that he really felt empowered to say, okay, this works. I'm gonna bring this to Brentford.
Right.
And so he was almost like testing the water. He wasn't
Mm.
quite sure what he was doing was actually
Yeah.
um, translatable to football. It was. He worked in Denmark, so he then had the confidence to say, okay, this is how we're going to do things from now on.
Right.
And that's when he appointed this quantitative analyst as sporting director, and that's when they really moved towards this new approach.
Right. And it's working out well for them. They're still in the Premier League as we speak. Yeah.
Yes, this season has been very difficult
Mm.
because they've had many injuries, and so in some respects have been playing with almost with a second team because
Mm.
they've had up to 8 or 10 injuries of key players. And the other thing to note is data analytics can only take you so far, and the strength of the squad
Yeah.
is obviously incredibly important.
Yeah.
There are academic studies which show the wage bill of the club. The higher the wage bill, the
Mm.
more likely the club is to finish high in the division. So if you've got a low wage bill, which Brentford does, one of the lowest in the
Mm.
Premier League, the chances are you're going to finish towards the bottom because that's the correlation shows
Yeah.
that the better players can command the better wages, and therefore they can propel the club up the league. The
Mm.
data only goes, as I said, only goes so far,
Right.
and so you can't win games with, if you have 20 quants
Mm.
working for you, that unfortunately is not going to score a goal.
Right.
That can help you with decisions and help with tactics, and it can help select players,
Mm.
but it's not necessarily a game changer at that top level of the game.
Yeah.
So at the moment, Matthew Benham is looking for outside investment to
Mm.
help increase the capital and help compete against some of the richer clubs,
Yeah.
because even staying in the Premier League is a huge challenge.
Right. And one challenge that Brentfords of the world face is the players get poached eventually. And what happens is when you are key talent, unless you are a Vardy who will still play for Leicester City even if you're demoted or relegated rather. But so once the talent gets is gone, then you have to reinvest again, find somebody in, get them to get used to the Brentford way of doing things. So it's always a constant race towards you're running hard to stay in the same place once you've achieved that. Then
Yeah, that's right. And you have to be planning 2-3 years ahead.
yeah.
So you're not just planning for what the next month or the next 3 months, but you're planning different eventualities. I think this season they've been planning for the eventuality that they were relegated. Luckily, they didn't get relegated, but you have to like factor in different scenarios, and so I think the planning that they use is quite advanced. It's not the traditional one where you just if you
Right.
sign one player, then you go and look for a new one. So this season, already a few months ago, they signed a striker for next season, a Brazilian striker who's playing in Belgium, because they knew Ivan Toney, their main striker, was probably going to leave after the season. So they were already thinking ahead, and sort of, making sure that they're prepared for players leaving.
Right. And just one last one. How did Hey Jude by Paul McCartney become a bit of an anthem for Brentford? Would you have any idea when did this start? Because during these games, you hear the crowd chant that song. Every team has their own song or tagline, and it's Hey Jude for Brentford.
Yeah, so it's there's no there's no really good reason. It was just
Yeah.
at the time, when the song first came out, I think it was in the late 60s, perhaps 1969.
Mm.
The DJ at the club, called Peter Gillam, he kind of liked the song, and he knew somebody. I think he knew someone called Jude or Judith,
Mm.
and so he started to play this record a lot. If you know the song, it sort of it's quite a sort of inspiring song. It sort of builds up to a crescendo, and so he thought this was a good song to use as the team was coming out, because it sort of built up the crowd and built up the atmosphere, and it just stuck. And it's been used ever since for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
That they've used the same song, and there's no real connection to the club apart from it just happened. It was just happenstance. It just happened, and it's I've probably heard it hundreds and hundreds of
Yeah.
times at the club. So every time I hear it, I associate it with Brentford,
Yeah.
even though there's no proper link. Obviously, the Beatles are from Liverpool.
Yeah.
The song has nothing to do with Brentford, but
Right.
it gradually sort of became the Brentford song,
Mm.
and is now sort of intertwined with the club's history.
Lovely. This is the book for those who are also watching this on YouTube. And lovely book, Alex. And enjoyed reading this. Before we started recording, I was telling you about how it is not really meant for, or rather, one need not be a football fan to be able to read this. And one need not even know about mathematics or economics or quant. It just has the relevant anecdotes which keep you interested. And how did you know what to leave out? Is one question that I have, because it's a world with too many numbers, or how did you figure out what to keep and what to leave out?
Well, I guess it just maybe I don't know. I suppose it's just journalist instinct. You try to keep the story flowing without trying to get bogged down in certain subjects. I just, to be honest, I just write what I'm interested in, and then I hope that other people are interested as well. I
Right.
think that's the key of writing a book. You've got to do something that you're interested in. I had an editor as well who helped me sort of shape plots. So that was very helpful. Obviously, to get another perspective
Yeah.
is very helpful, because you spend a lot of time on the book yourself, and you need a second opinion. So that is always good to get someone to say, okay, why don't you take out that bit, or just to put a bit more in there. But yeah, the process is very much, my process is just writing about what I think is interesting.
Well, that's simple and effective. Good advice for those who plan to take this for a living. Thanks again, Alex, for your time on this podcast. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Abhishek. It's been a pleasure from my side.